For over 40 years, the United States and Iran have been locked in a Cold War that constantly threatens to turn hot. The headlines are a repeating loop of confrontation. Burning flags in Tehran, seized oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, nuclear standoffs, and shadow wars fought by proxy from Yemen to Iraq. Chants of death to America have echoed for generations. To most Americans, it feels like a permanent, almost irrational hatred. Why this country? Why this specific, unending hostility? This cycle of conflict is the central foreign policy puzzle of the 21st century. It dictates the price of gas, drags America into Middle Eastern conflicts, and shapes global alliances. We are told the story begins in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution and the storming of the U.S. Embassy. But this is like starting a movie in the final act. It explains the what, but not the why. To understand why the embassy was stormed, why the Ayatollahs rose to power, and why that deep well of resentment exists, you have to go back further. The truth is, the entire 40-year crisis, the revolution, the hostage crisis, the nuclear program, is a direct consequence of a single, covert operation in the summer of 1953. It was an operation conceived in London, approved in Washington, and executed in Tehran for a reported cost of $1 million. This is the story of how the CIA, in its first ever covert action to overthrow a foreign government, destroyed a promising democracy and installed a dictator. Because of this single act, a deep-seated national narrative of American betrayal was burned into the Iranian soul. It replaced a popular, democratic movement with an authoritarian monarchy that was seen by its own people as an illegitimate American puppet. This single event created the wound that has never healed. It is the original sin from which all the subsequent chaos has grown. To solve this puzzle, we have to trace the poison back to its source. We have to go back to a time before the Shah, before the Ayatollah, to a charismatic, democratically elected leader who dared to believe his country's most valuable resource actually belonged to his country. He was a man who simply said no, and for that, he had to be destroyed. The man who started it all was not a radical cleric or a military strongman. He was Mohammad Mossadegh, a frail, elderly aristocrat with a European law degree who often conducted state business from his bed. To Western eyes, he was an eccentric, emotional politician. But to millions of Iranians, he was a hero, the democratically elected prime minister who embodied their hope for a modern, independent nation. His core motivation was simple and profoundly threatening. He believed Iran's oil should belong to Iran. This is why that belief was so dangerous. For decades, Iran's vast oil fields were controlled by a single entity, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or AIOC. But this was no simple business deal. The AIOC was effectively an arm of the British government, which was its largest shareholder. The terms were brutally one-sided. Think of it like this. Someone else owns the only well in your town. They take all the water, sell it for a fortune, and give you just enough change to patch the well's leaky roof. This was the Oil Concession Model. Britain got rich, fueling its navy and rebuilding its post-war economy, while Iran, the actual owner of the oil, remained impoverished. Watching this from London was Winston Churchill, a man who saw the world as a map of British imperial interests. To him, Mossadegh wasn't a patriot. He was a thief, threatening the lifeblood of the empire. The cheap, plentiful oil from Iran wasn't a luxury for Britain. It was a strategic necessity. Without it, the Royal Navy couldn't patrol the seas, and British industry would grind to a halt. Churchill viewed Mossadegh's demands for a fair deal, not as a negotiation, but as an act of extortion that could not be tolerated. So in March of 1951, Mossadegh, backed by a unanimous vote in Iran's parliament, made his calculated move. He nationalized the AIOC, declaring that Iran's oil now belonged to the Iranian people. It was a singular act of defiance against a global superpower. With this one decision, Mossadegh signed his own political death warrant. Because of this, a furious Churchill knew he had lost control of his most valuable asset. He needed a partner to get it back. His next call would be to Washington. Winston Churchill's first attempts to convince Washington fell on deaf ears. President Truman, wary of British colonialism, saw the dispute for what it was, a commercial squabble. But then came the 1952 American election, and with it, a consequential change in leadership. This is why the British diplomatic failure was about to become an American intelligence success. The new administration featured two brothers who saw the world in black and white: communism and freedom. John Foster Dulles, the new Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles, the new director of the CIA. Before their government posts, the Dulles brothers were partners at Sullivan and Cromwell, America's most powerful corporate law firm. Their clients included international banks and oil companies, including the parent company of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Because of this, they didn't just understand the corporate world, they were products of it. They viewed the world through the lens of protecting American assets and containing Soviet influence. To them, a country nationalizing its resources wasn't exercising sovereignty. It was opening the door to chaos and, inevitably, communism. So when Churchill called again, he had a new, much more receptive audience. He didn't frame the problem as Britain losing its oil, he framed it as the West losing Iran. His argument was a calculated masterpiece of Cold War paranoia. Mossadegh, he claimed, was a frail, emotional leader who was losing control to Iran's pro-Soviet Tudeh party. The choice was stark: act now, or watch the Red Army gain a strategic foothold on the Persian Gulf. For the Dulles brothers, this reframing was decisive. A British corporate problem was now officially an American national security emergency. With the decision made, Allen Dulles needed a man to run the operation. He chose Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Teddy Roosevelt, a former academic. Roosevelt was a cool, methodical operative, the perfect man for a mission that required a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. The plan he was given had a code name: Operation Ajax. And it had a budget that, even then, was shockingly small: $1 million. The core question was simple: how do you overthrow a popular, democratically elected government for the price of a Beverly Hills mansion? The answer reveals the new, cost-effective blueprint for American intervention. This wasn't a military invasion. It was psychological warfare. Roosevelt arrived in Tehran in July 1953 with suitcases full of cash and a three-part plan. First, propaganda. He hired journalists, editors, and even mullahs to blanket the country with stories painting Mossadegh as a corrupt, anti-Islamic communist sympathizer. The goal was to sow confusion and erode the prime minister's base of support. Second, manufactured chaos. Roosevelt's agents used CIA funds to hire what they called rent-a-mobs, thugs, and paid protesters who would stage violent demonstrations, clashing with Mossadegh's supporters. This created the illusion that the country was descending into civil war and that the government had lost control. The final piece was the triggers. Roosevelt needed the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to sign decrees dismissing Mossadegh and appointing a CIA-backed general. But here was the problem. The Shah was terrified. A weak and indecisive ruler, he feared Mossadegh's popularity and was convinced the plan would fail, leading to his own execution. It took Roosevelt days of clandestine meetings and immense pressure to get the Shah to act. The linchpin of the entire $1 million plan rested on the courage of a man who had none. The initial attempt was a catastrophic failure. When the Shah's decrees were delivered on August 15th, Mossadegh's intelligence network was ready. The officer delivering the dismissal was arrested. The plot was exposed. And the Shah, panicking, fled the country in his private plane. From Washington, the CIA sent a cable to Kermit Roosevelt. The mission was over. Abort. But Roosevelt made a calculated decision. He ignored the order. He knew something his bosses in Washington didn't. The propaganda campaign had worked better than expected. The city was a powder keg, and he still had a lot of cash. This decision to disobey is why the modern relationship between America and Iran is poisoned. He unleashed the second part of his plan: manufactured chaos. On August 19th, Roosevelt's agents paid crowds to pour into the streets of Tehran. These weren't political idealists. They were circus performers, weightlifters, and hired thugs, waving portraits of the exiled Shah and attacking symbols of Mossadegh's government. This created the critical illusion of a popular uprising. The army, seeing the streets fill with pro-Shah protesters and with key generals already on the CIA payroll, hesitated. That hesitation was everything. The CIA-backed mobs seized the radio station, broadcasting that Mossadegh had fallen and the Shah was returning. It was a lie that quickly became the truth. By afternoon, the military joined the coup. Tanks surrounded Mohammad Mossadegh's home. After a brief, bloody battle, the democratically elected leader of Iran surrendered to prevent a civil war. Democracy in Iran died that day, not in an election, but in a street brawl, orchestrated for a few $100,000. Because of the coup, when Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi flew back to Tehran, he returned not as a triumphant sovereign, but as an employee. He owed his throne entirely to American and British intelligence, and they came to collect their payment. This transaction would define his rule and sow the seeds of the 1979 revolution. The price for his crown was Iran's oil. Mossadegh's nationalization was reversed. But instead of the British simply taking back control, a new arrangement was made. It was called the consortium. Think of it as a corporate board of directors for an entire nation's oil supply. A group of Western companies would now manage, produce, and sell Iran's oil, giving the Iranian government a 50% cut of the profits. On the surface, it sounded fair, but here's the strategic masterstroke. For the first time, American companies were given a massive 40% stake. The CIA hadn't just overthrown a leader, it had executed a hostile takeover. For the Iranian people, this was the ultimate humiliation. Their democratic movement had been crushed so that American corporations could get rich off their natural resources. This is the moment the Shah became, in the eyes of his own people, an American puppet. He understood this. He knew his power no longer came from his people, but from Washington. And because he could not rule with legitimacy, he would have to rule with fear. The Shah's throne was a golden cage, lavishly decorated by Western oil money, but built and locked by foreign hands. This deep-seated illegitimacy created the vacuum that, 25 years later, an exiled Ayatollah would be more than willing to fill. Because the Shah could not rule with legitimacy, he made a calculated decision to rule with fear. He needed an organization to enforce his will, to hunt down his enemies, and to make the very idea of dissent terrifying. This is why, in 1957, with direct assistance and training from the CIA and Israel's Mossad, the Shah created his own internal security service. It was called SAVK. Think of SAVK not as a police force, but as the central nervous system of the monarchy. Its only purpose was to detect and eliminate threats to the throne. Its agents were everywhere, in universities, in factories, in cafes. Its methods were systematic and brutal. Surveillance, censorship, arbitrary arrest, and torture were not just tactics. They were official policy. For a quarter century, SAVK became the most hated and feared institution in Iran. This had a profound and lasting consequence for the United States. Every time a student activist disappeared, every time a dissident was tortured in a prison, the Iranian people didn't just blame the Shah. They blamed the country that had put him on the throne and taught him how to stay there. SAVK was the engine of fear that kept the Shah in power, but it was an engine designed and fueled by his American patrons. This made the United States not a distant ally, but a direct accomplice in the suffering of the Iranian people. Washington had helped create a monster to guard its oil interests, and in doing so, it ensured that any future rebellion against the Shah would also be a rebellion against America. For 25 years, the pressure built. The Shah's SAVK could imprison dissidents, but it couldn't kill an idea. And the central idea that animated 2 generations of Iranians was the narrative of betrayal. The story was simple, powerful, and repeated in secret whispers across the country. Our democracy was stolen in 1953. It was stolen by the Americans for oil. The Shah is their agent, and his secret police are their enforcers. This narrative became the revolution's DNA. This is precisely why the 1979 Iranian Revolution, when it finally exploded, was so virulently anti-American. It wasn't just a political or religious uprising. It was an act of national exorcism. The chants on the streets of Tehran, "Death to the Shah," were almost always followed by "Death to America." To the revolutionaries, the two were inseparable. The Shah was the symptom. America was the disease. Overthrowing the monarchy was not enough. They had to sever the connection to the foreign power they believed had corrupted their nation from the very beginning. This long memory explains the events that define the U.S.-Iran relationship to this day. When Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage, it was not a random act of chaos. It was a deeply symbolic act of revenge. They saw the embassy not as a diplomatic mission, but as the nest of spies that had orchestrated the 1953 coup and propped up the Shah for decades. They were closing a circle that had been opened with a $1 million briefcase 26 years earlier. The chickens, as they say, had come home to roost. The chickens, as they say, had come home to roost. But this raises the final, crucial question. Was this entire 70-year tragedy truly about stopping the spread of Soviet communism? Or was that just a convenient excuse? The answer, and the key to understanding the entire unbreakable curse on U.S.-Iran relations, lies not in geopolitical maps, but in the resumes of two powerful brothers. John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles, the Director of the CIA. Before they were the architects of American foreign policy, the Dulles brothers were the kings of corporate law. As senior partners at the powerful firm Sullivan & Cromwell, their main clients were the titans of American industry. They represented international banks, resource conglomerates, and most consequentially, the predecessors to the very oil companies threatened by Mossadegh's nationalization. Their entire professional lives were spent defending the principle that American corporations had a right to foreign resources. This wasn't a conspiracy, it was their worldview. For them, there was no difference between the interests of Standard Oil and the interests of the United States. This is the hidden mechanism that drove the coup. To the Dulles brothers, Mossadegh's move wasn't just a political challenge. It was an attack on the global economic order they had helped build and personally profited from. The fear wasn't that Iran would become a Soviet satellite. The strategic fear was that nationalization itself would become a contagious idea. If Iran succeeded, what was to stop Egypt from nationalizing the Suez Canal, or Guatemala from reclaiming land from the United Fruit Company? The $1 million operation was, in essence, a corporate bailout disguised as a Cold War battle. It was an intervention to kill an economic idea, using the fear of communism as the justification. Because of this, the deep Iranian suspicion of American motives isn't paranoia. It's pattern recognition. The 1953 coup established the foundational narrative. America does not act out of principle, but for profit. It will sacrifice another nation's democracy for its own economic convenience. This single act of bad faith poisoned the well of diplomacy for generations. It's why every American proposal, every sanction, and every negotiation is viewed through a lens of profound mistrust. The relationship was built on a calculated deception, and Iranians have never forgotten it. The $1 million plan was a stunning tactical success and a world-altering strategic failure. It secured Western access to Iranian oil for another quarter century. But in exchange, it created a permanent enemy, fueled a radical revolution, and locked the United States into a cycle of conflict that has cost trillions of dollars and destabilized an entire region. It's a stark reminder that when a nation confuses its corporate interests with its national interests, the bill eventually comes due. And sometimes, it takes a lifetime to pay. If you found this eye-opening, hit subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden causes. And leave a comment. What other historical events do you think were driven more by business than by politics?